Hello, wonderful human beings of this fantastic, phantasmagorical planet. I've had a haircut yesterday, so I'm now 40 years old with extreme male pattern baldness, a much more streamlined aesthetic, so I could go into a wind tunnel, be much more aerodynamic now, which is a bonus. And I'm in my new accommodation outside the hospital, which I've only been in for about a week, but I can't tell you how much it's improved my life and given me productivity. I've got some movement on some of the verticals I'm developing, try and make the world a better place and redistribute wealth to all the people I've alienated by accusing them of all kinds of things. I'm well known by my friends and peers as being a big proponent of David Icke books. I've read about 10 of them. His early ones are quite interesting, really. There's no conjecture or hyperbole about aliens or anything. He talks about kind of ley lines and the evolution of spiritual consciousness and universal consciousness and stuff that's all quite interesting if you like that kind of thing. You also got what in his books is kind of like a psyop, counterintelligence, whereby you put a little bit of the truth and a little bit of bollocks together into a book. And people say, when you talk about the truth, they say, "Where did you hear that, mate?" And you say his name and they go, "Ah, yes," and just disregard it straight away. Just quite a good platform for the status quo and the aristocracy to maintain that bifurcation and conflagration and inference kind of like and conflation to discredit ideas that there might be corrupt factions within the Department of Health and Social Care or anywhere in the public sector, really, that work as child sex traffickers, make extremely good money doing it, and often use it to bribe and blackmail and control coercively people. It's a cause that's quite sort of controversial, but I think it's something which we all need to consider as human beings. So today's video is about Mr. Icke and his works, and I've been putting turmeric in the bottom of my quadruple strength little squash. Tends to settle at the bottom. Pretty cool, isn't it? Sorry about that. Let's get into the reading then, shall we? I haven't read it myself, so I can't give any reviews, but did a pretty good prompt. Epistemological gatekeeping, conspirituality, and the anatomy of disinformation, an investigative analysis of David Icke's literary corpus. The intersection of alternative spirituality, political conspiracism, and the investigative journalism occupies a highly contested, deeply complex space in contemporary media sociology. Within this volatile milieu, a few figures are as polarizing, prolific, or paradoxical as the British author and former sports broadcaster David Vaughan Icke. Over the course of 3 decades, Icke has constructed a sprawling literary and philosophical architecture that attempts to unify anomalous phenomena, New Age theology, and deep state political machinations into a singular overarching cosmological narrative. To the mainstream observer, his corpus is overwhelmingly defined by what academics term the reptilian thesis. The assertion that a race of interdimensional, shape-shifting reptilian entities, known as the Archons or Anunnaki, controls the global and financial elite. However, a granular explanation of his body of work reveals a profound structural paradox. Embedded seamlessly within labyrinthine descriptions of draconian hybrids and Saturn-Moon matrices are highly accurate, pioneering exposures of general institutional corruption, financial manipulation, and most notably state-sponsored elite child abuse networks. Long before mainstream investigative journalism or public statutory inquiries acknowledged the predatory actions of establishment figures such as Jimmy Savile, Edward Heath, or Cyril Splitt, these precise allegations were meticulously documented in David Icke's self-published text. The presence of highly sensitive, factually grounded allegations of institutional abuse operates side by side with extreme science fiction tropes, presents a found sociological and epistemological puzzle for the modern journalist. It forces the consideration of a proactive, yet analytically necessary hypothesis. Could this unique conflation of profound, dangerous truth and absolute absurdity serve a specific functional purpose for the established power structure? Specifically, could the architecture of Icke's work serve wittingly or even unwittingly as a sophisticated counterintelligence mechanism designed to execute a massive campaign of disinformation and poisoning the well? When a layman begins questioning sex trafficking sponsored by the corrupt factions of the public sphere, they will inevitably encounter Icke's material. They will subsequently ask the grassroots researcher, "Where did you hear that from?" As soon as his name is uttered, every rational, discerning adult will simply disregard the information entirely. By analysing the chronological evolution of his literature, the structural barriers of United Kingdom defamation law and academic frameworks of conspirituality and historical precedents of state-sponsored cognitive infiltration, this report explores the functional impact of David Icke's work as a potential neutralising agent against grassroots activism. Phase 1. The spiritual genesis and collapse of mainstream publishing. To comprehend the mechanics and potential intelligence functions of David Icke's later work, it's essential to trace the chronological evolution of his early literature and public persona. Icke's career did not begin in the fringes of alternative media. It was firmly rooted in the conventional realm of mainstream British culture. After an early career as a professional football goalkeeper for Coventry City and Hereford United, was prematurely ended at the age of 21 by severe rheumatoid arthritis. I think it's muscular dystrophy actually, but Icke transitioned into sports journalism. By 1981, he had ascended the national prominence as a sports broadcaster for BBC, eventually co-hosting its flagship programme, Grandstand. The early corpus, environmentalism and the New Age holism. During the 1980s, in an effort to relieve his debilitating arthritis, Icke began to engage with alternative medicine and New Age philosophies, which spurred an interest in green politics. He briefly served as a national spokesperson for the UK Green Party. That was his book, It Doesn't Have to Be Like This. It's quite a good read, actually. In 1990, experiencing a profound personal crisis, Icke visited a psychic healer named Betty Shine, who reportedly informed him that he was on Earth for a specific purpose and would receive messages from the spirit world. This encounter catalysed a highly public spiritual awakening. In 1991, he famously appeared on the BBC's Wogan talk show, where he faced severe public ridicule after making claims regarding his spiritual purpose and predicting impending geological catastrophes. Following this broadcast, Icke withdrew from mainstream media and commenced a prolific writing career rooted firmly in New Age philosophy. His early books, such as The Truth Vibrations of 91, Days of Decision in 93, and Heal the World 94, were deeply embedded in the New Age milieu. These texts espoused a holistic worldview, emphasizing environmentalism, the interconnectedness of human consciousness, and the existence of a benevolent spiritual dimension. The early texts were highly optimistic, suggesting that humanity was on the verge of a positive evolutionary leap in consciousness, a common teleological narrative, in New Age thought at the time. They were quite good. I read his early books. However, as the 1990s progressed, the anticipated utopian transformation failed to materialise. The New Age movement experienced a collective crisis meaning, struggling to reconcile its holistic, positive worldview with the continuation of war, inequity, and systemic elite corruption. It was during this period that Icke's literature underwent a radical transformation, introducing a conspiracist theodicy to explain the failure of the New Age he'd predicted. The schism, excommunicating, and the power of self-publishing. The transitional phase of Icke's work occurred within the publication of The Robots' Rebellion 94 and The Truth Shall Set You Free 95. In these volumes, Icke proposed that a global elite was actively manipulating human society to prevent the impending spiritual awakening. Crucially, in attempting to map the historical architecture of this control system, Icke began incorporating elements of classical political conspiracy theory. The inclusion of highly controversial material, most notably references to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is shown to be a hoax, an established 19th century anti-Semitic forgery, there you are, caused a terminal rupture between Icke and the mainstream publishing industry. His publisher at the time, Gateway Books, refused to print and the Truth Will Set You Free due to its inclusion of Holocaust revisionism and its reliance on anti-Semitic tropes regarding international banking dynasties. Causation doesn't equal causality. Causation doesn't equal causality. Serial killers might eat carrots. There is quite a lot of Hebrews who work in banking, but lots of serial killers who eat peas and carrots too. So make of that what you will. This rejection forced Icke to establish his own independent publishing house, initially named Bridge of Love Publications and later rebranded as David Icke Books. From an epistemological and journalistic standpoint, this forced transaction to self-publishing is the most critical juncture in his career. By stepping entirely outside the institutional boundaries of traditional publishing, Icke was liberated from editorial oversight, legal vetting, and fact-checking protocols. This absolute editorial autonomy created a unique, unfiltered literary environment where meticulously researched data regarding geopolitical power and corruption could be seamlessly interwoven with the unverified esoteric channelings and extreme cosmological claims without any institutional friction. Phase 2, the reptilian thesis and the architecture of conspirituality. Gemini loves the word architecture, doesn't it? It's like every article I read, they always talk about architecture. Operating entirely through this own publishing apparatus, Icke released his magnum opus, The Biggest Secret, in 1999. This exhaustive text marked the formal introduction of reptilian thesis, a cosmological framework that would define the remainder of his expansive career. He still gets quite a lot of airtime, David Icke. I've seen him on various different YouTube channels over the last 6 months. People still go to his events and buy his books and invite him onto their shows and stuff. The mechanics of the reptilian thesis in The Biggest Secret, Icke posited that the global elite, encompassing the Illuminati, the British royal family, and international banking dynasties, were not entirely human. Instead, they were genetically modified human reptilian hybrids, crossbred in antiquity by an extraterrestrial or interdimensional race known as the Anunnaki or the Archons. Drawing heavily upon the controversial translations of Sumerian texts by Zechariah Sitchin, as well as the testimonies of South American Sangoma Credo Mutwa, Icke constructed a narrative wherein these reptilian entities operate just outside the frequency of normal human visual perception. According to this thesis, these reptilian entities require the ingestion of human blood and the continuous absorption of negative energy generated through human fear, trauma, warfare, and conflict to maintain their vibrational frequency and shape-shifting abilities in this dimension. Consequently, global events are engineered from the shadows and perpetuate states of perpetual anxiety and trauma. Over the following 2 decades, Icke expanded this cosmology through a bit of a voluminous output of self-published literature, continuously integrating contemporary geopolitical and social events into his multi-dimensional framework. The tide had definitely turned from optimistic New Age environmentalism to a dark, sprawling narrative of draconian hybrid control. I don't do these. You can just pause it if you want and read it, but I can't be bothered to read these charts because they just do my nutting. The academic framework of conspirituality. In 2011, sociologists Charlotte Ward and David Voas coined the term conspirituality to describe the precise ideological synthesis that Icke had pioneered and popularised. Conspirituality represents the fusion of the typically female-dominated optimistic view age milieu with the typically male-dominated pessimistic realm of political conspiracy theory. Ward and Vos observed that the hybrid belief system is characterised by 2 core intertwined convictions. The first one being that a secret group covertly controls or is trying to control the political and social order. Second bit says that humanity is currently undergoing a paradigm shift in consciousness that will eventually overcome this control. Icke's work acts as the quintessential and most culturally visible expression of conspirituality by defining the global conspiracy not merely as a terrestrial political phenomenon, but as a spiritual interdimensional parasite. Icke provides a powerful theodicy, an explanation for why profound evil exists in a universe that he fundamentally claims is composed of infinite love. The reptilian thesis externalizes the source of systemic corruption, framing the elite as literal aliens to the human condition, thereby protecting the inherent goodness of humanity in the New Age worldview. Phase 3. Unearthing the unspeakable, institutional child abuse and the libel law vacuum. While the academic analysis of conspirituality provides an excellent framework for understanding the psychological appeal of Icke's cosmology, it critically fails to address Icke's most dangerous, compelling, and problematic aspect of his work. Embedded directly alongside the discussions of Draco-reptilian shape-shifting royalty in The Biggest Secret and subsequent works were exhaustive, highly specific allegations of systemic child abuse orchestrated by top members of the British government. In the late 90s and early noughties, Icke publicly and repeatedly named prominent figures, including BBC presenter Jimmy Savile, former Prime Minister Edward Heath, and Liberal MP Cyril Smith as active participants in elite paedophile rings. Furthermore, he detailed the precise mechanisms by which state institutions, children's homes, hospitals, and police forces were compromised to procure vulnerable children for these individuals to subsequently cover up their crimes through coordinated suppression. For over a decade, these claims were entirely ignored by the mainstream press and cited by critics as further definitive evidence of Icke's detachment from reality. However, following the death of Jimmy Savile in 2011, a dam of institutional silence broke. Subsequent police investigations, such as Operation Yewtree and massive public inquiries, most notably the UK government's independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, confirmed the horrifying reality of what Icke has alleged for years. Savile was indeed one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders, operating with near total impunity within state institutions, and figures like Cyril Smith were deeply implicated in historical covered-up abuse. The structural vacuum, United Kingdom defamation law. So it's quite a big issue, that one. So the critical journalistic question arises: why was a self-published New Age conspiracist documenting these verified atrocities while the entirety of the mainstream investigative press remained silent? The answer lies not in a lack of journalistic capability or awareness, but in the draconian nature of the United Kingdom's defamation and libel laws during that era. Prior to the passage of Defamation Act 2013, English libel law was notably hostile to publishers and heavily skewed towards the protection of elite reputations. Under the preceding framework of the Defamation Act 52, the burden of proof rested entirely on the defendant, the journalist or publisher, to prove the absolute truth of their statements rather than on the plaintiff to prove falsehood. Defamatory statements were automatically presumed to be false, and there was no requirement for the plaintiff to prove that they had suffered financial or reputational harm to initiate a devastating lawsuit. Because figures like Saville, Heath and Smith wielded immense institutional power, political influence and vast financial resources, they routinely utilised the threat of ruinous libel litigation to suppress journalistic investigations. Mainstream media organisations, driven by risk-averse corporate boards and legal departments, recognised that publishing allegations of elite paedophilia without an absolute bulletproof preponderance of evidence would result in devastating financial penalties and potential corporate bankruptcy. As a result, no traditional publisher would touch the subject of the elite institutional abuse with a barge pole. Ike, operating exclusively through his independent Bridge of Love publications, existed entirely outside of this corporate risk matrix. As a highly marginalised figure who'd already endured intense public ridicule and possessed little conventional institutional reputation to protect, he exhibited an extraordinary high tolerance for legal risk. Furthermore, his status as a fringe author meant that powerful figures were often reluctant to sue him. They calculated that initiating a high-profile libel trial against a man who publicly claimed they were a shape-shifting interdimensional reptiles would draw unwanted massive media attention to their private lives and, crucially, require them to testify under oath in a public forum subject to discovery. Thus, Ike's outcast status and integration of the absurd provided a bizarre form of operational legal immunity. It allowed him to publish the raw, terrifying testimonies of abuse survivors that mainstream journalists knew about were legally forced to suppress. Here's burden of proof, legal framework, impact on investigative journalism. So, and the sort of crimes sort of explains that a bit. Phase 4, disinformation, counterintelligence and poisoning the well. The juxtaposition of verified institutional horrors and interdimensional reptilian overlords within the exactly same text leads to the core analytical hypothesis to this investigative report. When a single body of work seamlessly integrates documented, highly sensitive atrocities which fundamentally threaten the established power structure with science fiction absurdities which provoke universal societal mockery, one must rigorously question the functional output of that literature. David Icke could be, whether as a highly sophisticated writing counterintelligence agent or an unwittingly manipulated asset, a primary vector for state-sponsored disinformation. The architecture, again, architecture is lovely, let's build a house with Gemini, of poisoning the well. In rhetorical analysis, the intelligence terminology poisoning the well is an informal logical fallacy and potent psychological warfare tactic. It occurs when irrelevant, adverse, or absurd information is preemptively associated with a target or topic to thoroughly discredit whatever the target is about to say or whatever the topic reveals. In the context of investigative journalism and grassroots political activism, the well represents the reservoir of legitimate evidence regarding institutional corruption, financial fraud, and elite sex trafficking. By institutionally pouring poison in this case, the reptilian thesis, the Saturn-Moon matrix, and multidimensional draconian law into that exact same well, the entirety of the water becomes undrinkable to the rational public. Consider the practical sociological outcome. When an ordinary citizen or a discerning mainstream journalist begins investigating the very real mechanisms of state-sponsored abuse, they will inevitably encounter the suppressed evidence that Icke has aggregated. However, because Icke has aggressively monopolised this specific domain of alternative resource for decades, the layman will inevitably ask the grassroots activists, Where did you hear about this VIP abuse ring? The moment the activist cites Icke or utilises terminology popularised by his books, the rational adult immediately associates the claim with shape-shifting lizards and entirely disregards the information as total garbage. This dynamic is widely recognised in academic sociology as the weaponisation of stigmatised knowledge. As political scientist Michael Barkin details in A Culture of Conspiracy, when legitimate empirical inquiries become tethered to wildly stigmatised concepts like UFOs, demonic possession or reptilians, the intense social stigma rapidly transfers to the legitimate inquiry, effectively neutralising it and protecting the institution under scrutiny. Historical precedents of the IRD and COINTELPRO. So the use of highly calibrated disinformation to neutralise political threats and protect the state apparatus is a well-documented staple of modern statecraft and counterintelligence. Two primary historical examples clearly illustrate how intelligence agencies actively utilise the conflation of truth and extreme fiction to manage populations, disrupt dissidents, and misdirect grassroots campaigns to the will of the powers that be. The Information Research Department. Created in 1948 by the British Foreign Office, the Information Research Department was a highly secretive psychological warfare and propaganda unit that operated clandestine until 1977. The IRD was tasked with constructing Soviet influence and ruthlessly suppressing post-anti-colonial movements globally. While the IRD frequently distributed factual information, its most devastating and relevant work involved black propaganda, the creation of entirely fabricated documents, front organisations and forged literature designed to deceive audiences and discredit targets. IRD operatives such as disinformation agent Hans Weiser and John Rayner would forge statements from Soviet agencies like Novosti or create fake radical groups such as forged literature purporting to be from the Muslim Brotherhood to sow chaos, incite violence and make their adversaries appear irrational or dangerously fanatical. By coverting, subsidising commercial publishers and feeding manipulated information to a network of over 100 mainstream journalists, the IRD successfully polluted the global information ecosystem. They intimately understood that by inserting a highly calibrated piece of fantasy, extremism or absurdity into an otherwise legitimately political movement, they could permanently destroy its credibility. FBI COINTELPRO. In the United States, the FBI's counterintelligence program, operating aggressively from 1956 to 1971, utilised similar tactics against domestic residents. COINTELPRO operations were designed not merely to gather intelligence, but to actively disrupt, misdirect and neutralise organisations deemed a threat to the established political or social order. Tactics included deploying informants to advocate for absurd, extreme or violent actions, thereby alienating the group's moderate base, fracturing the movement internally, and providing a pretext for public dismissal or state intervention. Phase 5. The Sunstein Doctrine and Cognitive Infiltration. While the IRD and COINTELPRO represent mid-century historical examples, the theoretical framework for modern counterintelligence operations against conspiracy movements and grassroots activism was explicitly articulated in recent academic literature. In 2009, Cass Sunstein, who would shortly thereafter serve as President Barack Obama's administration for Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and Aidan Vermeule, both Harvard law professors, published a highly controversial paper in the Journal of Political Philosophy titled Conspiracy Theories, Causes and Cures. In this paper, Sunstein and Vermeule analysed the proliferation of conspiracy theories, specifically focusing on those challenging official state narratives, taking the 9/11 truth movement as their running example, and diagnosed the adherents as suffering from crippled epistemology, because conspiracy theorists exist in informational isolation and view direct government rebuttals as further proof of the conspiracy, a self-sealing mechanism. The authors argued that traditional public relations strategies are entirely ineffective. To solve this, Sunstein and Vermeulen formally proposed that the government engage in cognitive infiltration of these extremist networks. The strategy entails deploying government agents or their allies to covertly enter conspiracy communities, often operating anonymously or under false identities. The goal of this infiltration is not to arrest individuals, but to introduce informational diversity designed to plant doubts, fracture group cohesion, and break up the self-sealing nature of the moment. Counterintelligence, black propaganda, co-intel, pro-cognitive infiltration, Sunstein, faulty-facing documents, etc., etc., etc. Doesn't go sideways, so it does. Yeah, there you go. You can read all of that. I don't like it. If one were to view David Icke's vast literary output through the precise lens of Sunstein's cognitive infiltration, the structural utility of the reptilian thesis becomes glaringly apparent. When a grassroots movement begins to gather legitimate momentum around the exposure of institutional child abuse, high-level financial corruption, or state-sponsored violence, the intelligence apparatus faces a crisis. Attempting to suppress the information directly often triggers to the Streisand effect, validating the movement's claims. However, applying the Sunstein doctrine offers an elegant solution by allowing or covertly encouraging a prominent figure to mix those highly damaging truths with extreme cosmological fantasies. For example, that the Queen's a shape-shifting lizard. The intelligence apparatus effectively executes a cognitive infiltration on a macro scale. The truth is not suppressed, it's rendered toxic by its association. Phase 6. The controlled opposition hypothesis and media gatekeeping. Within contemporary conspiracy subcultures themselves, this dynamic has not gone unnoticed. An increasingly prevalent critique among alternative researchers is that Icke functions precisely as controlled opposition. The concept of controlled opposition dictates that establishment permits and even subtly promotes a subversive figure who appears to be fiercely fighting the system. This figure is allowed to reveal a certain quota of genuine truth, information that's already leaking into the public domain or is impossible to entirely suppress. By delivering this truth boldly, the figure gains immense trust, epistemic authority, and massive following among the disillusioned public. However, once the audience is completely captured, the controlled opposition figure steers the narrative off an intellectual cliff by guiding the grassroots energy away from actionable political reform, legal prosecution, or structural economic critique, and directing it instead towards battling multi-dimensional draconian entities. In the astral plane, the movement is effectively castrated. Tangible political mobilization is replaced by esoteric meditation and paranoid paralysis. The aristocracy remains entirely safe from a populace that believes its true enemy resides in a differing dimension. The role of media gatekeeping. Quite important, this one. This containment strategy operates symbiotically with the sociological concept of media gatekeeping. Gatekeeping, a theory pioneered by social psychologist Kurt Lewin and expanded by David Manning White, describes the process by which institutions, editors, and algorithms filter information, deciding what is granted epistemic authority and what is excluded from the public sphere. Icke's work provides mainstream media gatekeepers with the ultimate pretext for boundary maintenance. Because Icke has positioned himself as the loudest and most prolific voice on topics like institutional paedophilia or the deep state, media organisations can engage in aggressive epistemological gatekeeping simply by invoking his name. The label conspiracy theorist functions as a heuristic stop sign. As social research indicates, the deployment of this label serves as boundary work, allowing established institutions to swiftly delegitimize alternative knowledge without ever having to engage with the actual evidence presented. Therefore, if an independent journalist approaches a major publisher with a meticulously documented dossier on state-sponsored sex trafficking, the editor can simply point to Icke's literature, conflate the journalist's work with conspiritualist paranoia and refuse publication. In this way, Icke's presence in the informational ecosystem serves as a highly effective immunological defense mechanism for the establishment. He provides the toxic outer shell, the reptilians, that prevent the public antibody journalistic scrutiny from reaching and destroying the pathogen, institutional corruption. In conclusion, the vast literary output of David Icke presents one of the most fascinating epistemological case studies of the 21st century, charting his evolution from New Age spiritualism in the early 1990s to the dark, multi-dimensional conspirituality of his later works, reveals a complex tapestry of profound truth, inextricably entangled in extreme cosmological fantasy. For the investigative journalist or the media sociologist, the question of whether David Icke is a writing counterintelligence agent purposefully deployed to execute a campaign of cognitive infiltration, or simply an idiosyncratic author whose genuine belief in interdimensional entities organically evolved, is ultimately secondary to the functional impact of his work. The demonstrable reality is that Icke's literature operates as a highly efficient mechanism for poisoning the well, by aggressively promoting names of genuine acute abusers like Jimmy Savile or Cyril Smith, while mainstream media covered behind the UK's Defamation Act 52, Icke secured his position as a heroic truth-teller to the marginalised. Yet, by inextricably wielding those horrific truths to the reptilian thesis, the Saturn-Moon matrix and archonic hybridization program, he ensured that this evidence became permanently radioactive to the orthodox world. When discerning adults, academic research, and legal authorities seek to investigate the very real networks of institutional corruption, the shadow of David Icke stands as an impenetrable barrier of stigma. Grassroots campaigns seeking justice and structural change are easily dismissed by media gatekeepers who merely have to point to the absurdity of draconian narratives to invalidate the entire movement. Thus, regardless of intent, the architecture of David Icke's corpus functions perfectly as a state-level disinformation apparatus. It creates a paradigm of controlled opposition where the most dangerous secrets of the elite are simultaneously exposed and fundamentally protected, hidden in plain sight amidst a labyrinth of science fiction, enduring the survival of the very power structures that he claims to oppose. Maybe don't read David Icke's books. Maybe do read David Icke's books. Maybe take 4 diazepam a day like I do and dribble out of your arse because you've had 1 pint of Thatcher's Haze the night before with your half-brother, especially if he's called Connor MacLeod and has a name which associates him with a quite shit movie from the olden days. Don't know really, man. Institutional child abuse is a thing, and no one's allowed to write about it because it's libelous, defamatory and slanderous. And I've come into contact with these kind of things firsthand, not with children, I've seen children be abused, but I knew it was kind of happening, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's this paradox, right? I mean, there's something you can do about it. I did try to do something about it. Didn't work well at all. You got somebody who knows that the Department of Health and Social Care might be involved in, the repetitive stories you hear about young people who've gone to foster parents, lived in orphanages, attend CAMS, like child acute mental health services. Lots of people that go through those unsettled formative years do face abuse and systematic sexual abuse as well. These aren't uncommon events, like they happen quite a lot. You hear about it quite a lot. You don't hear about it as much as you should. They don't want to tell anybody how the world really works because they all would cease to participate in it if they really understood how dark things were and on what sort of scale they operate. Maybe don't read his books. Maybe do read his books. Don't tell me about it though. Tell the people that you love. And tell your teenagers, because they're the next generation that are going to separate the wheat from the chaff, and look out for forward intelligence operatives in their campaign groups that are trying to kind of delegitimise and derail their movement. Yeah, sad times, dangerous times, terrifying times, and chronic post-traumatic stress disorder indicative times. But it's the summer now, so enjoy the summer. I don't really have a family. My mum and dad are dead, and the rest of my family don't talk to me. I've just got my brother Connor, who I grew up with in Buckfastleigh, not far from where they make the Bucky tonic wine. They all drink in Scotland. I don't know how much of it's true, and I don't know how much of it's false. I've seen and done some pretty amazing things, you know. I can do things that other people can't do, you know. People fear the unknown. But what's worse is framing the unknown with a load of fucking tripe to try and keep it a secret. I'm a big fan of David Icke's work, and if I hadn't read his books, I arguably wouldn't have evolved to the state of kind of like critical discernment that I have now. I would probably still be labouring under the misapprehension that things are very different from where they are. But my life's journey's been complex, atypical, and tragic. Not just for myself, but for others too. On that bombshell, I'll see you later.